cyber is in some ways a meaningless term in terms of national security because it is everything. It underpins everything. It is part of everything.
Beth, your career spans more than 2 decades, during which you have focused on national security, intelligence, resilience, cybersecurity. Could you share a little bit about your journey and what inspired you to dedicate your career to these critical areas?
Yeah, so I think I've had quite an unusual career for a national security practitioner in that I've worked across lots of different topical areas and on lots of different disciplines as well. So I've worked in all three of our agencies in the UK, but I've also worked in policy departments, for example, the Home Office and Transport on security issues. And I've also worked in our equivalent of a situation centre, which is called Cobra in the UK, working on responses. I've worked on many, probably hundreds of different Cobra meetings over the years. So yeah, and then my most recent roles, I was on the board at GCHQ, our SIGINT agency, and I was then Deputy National Security Advisor in the UK from 2020 to 2022, specifically focusing on domestic security issues, resilience, and intelligence policy. So yeah, I've done all sorts of different things. And why have I done that? Well, I mean, I guess just a mix of intellectual curiosity and opportunity, and just kind of following my nose into various areas of interest. And I come from a sort of family background of public service, and I there is, even though I'm not in government anymore, I still have a very strong sense of whatever I work on, wanting it to make a contribution to the sort of public and global good. So, yeah, that's a bit about my background.
You've held some, I mean, very significant roles. I mean, Deputy National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister and Director General, which I guess in corporate speak would that be equivalent to like a COO of GCHQ?
Yes, that's right.
Curious, how did those two positions influence your perspective on the evolving nature of national security?
So, two really fabulous and different insights from those roles. First, working in GCHQ, which is obviously a technology organisation, um, it really brought into very sharp uh, focus how much of national security is both underpinned and potentially compromised by all things technical, digital, cyber, whatever terminology you want to use. That actually, as a policy practitioner or as somebody who'd worked on investigations or analysis before, I hadn't quite seen upfront some of those big vulnerabilities, and actually also some of the potential in government as well for technology to make a real difference to our national security. So I had that real kind of sort of bolt of technology input from GCHQ. And then when I landed in the Deputy National Security Advisor role, I was struck by how much work I was doing on what I call state threat. So that is the kind of breadth of activity by hostile state actors, whether that's Russia or China, North Korea, Iran. That's sort of a spectrum, a sort of toolkit, if you like, of things that they can do to achieve their objectives against another country, impacting them domestically. So that includes, your classic espionage. We're seeing a bit of that this week in the UK. I'm sure you followed the interesting case of the alleged Chinese spy that had attached himself to Prince Andrew. So it's espionage. It's also offensive cyber campaigns that are kind of compromising, whether it's CNI or government. Um, and it's a whole range of other things. Sabotage, another sort of up and coming trend. We've seen a lot of that too. So I spent a lot of time working on things that were case studies in that space, and a lot less on things like counterterrorism, a lot on things like investment security, which had not really previously. I mean, I sort of played a role in sort of smaller ways, but bringing through legislation to improve our investment security regime and starting to think about how we might join our system up a bit differently to deal with this very kind of broad hybrid set of threats that we were dealing with in the UK. So yeah, very sort of slightly different but complementary perspectives that I think just sort of broaden my mindset a little bit about what national security actually is and who should be playing a role.
It's interesting actually that cybersecurity almost slipped in there as a Freudian slip. I mean, I'm very curious how did the focus shift over perhaps the last decade or 2 decades. I mean, certainly 20 years ago, I think there was much more conversation around counterterrorism. When did cyber become a big deal? I think it was probably always in the mix, but when did it become a big deal in terms of the overall portfolio when you're starting to talk about national security and cyber as a large or growing component of it?
Well, it's interesting. I think probably from about 2010 on, it became a very, very major issue for the whole of the national security community. Um, Cyber was at one point a kind of a part of the activity of an agency, a SIGINT agency like GCHQ. There would have been a cyber division, but they still would have been concentrating on more traditional forms of capability building. I mean, really now there isn't. I mean, cyber is in some ways a meaningless term in terms of national security because it is everything. It underpins everything. It is part of everything. I think the Snowden leaks obviously were a bit of a kind of inflection point there. Certainly, some of the revelations there around how the US and allies went about their business was both really damaging, but also had to generate a whole new way of doing business in lots of different areas. So I think from that point onward, a different approach. And then I think also, from a kind of adversary perspective, the increased capabilities of some of our adversaries. So in tandem with what we were doing on cyber, China was growing its capability, reorganizing, putting its capabilities into the MSS rather than where it had previously sat in the military. Sort of huge amounts of resource going into that, the use of kind of proxy actors, the exploitation of some of their kind of corporate entities as well. So there was a sort of increase in our understanding of our opportunity space, our understanding of our own vulnerabilities as a nation, but also our adversaries, playing much more strongly as an opponent and as a kind of competitor in that tech space. So yeah, from 2010 on, but certainly by the time I arrived in the Deputy National Security Advisor role, we'd had the NCSC set up for 4 years. There were relatively regular cyber cobras being called on a variety of issues. It was very kind of central to the work we were doing at the core of the national security community.
So it's interesting. You mentioned about China migrating their cyber capabilities out from the military to the MSS, the Ministry for State Security, and I think similarly amongst America, Canada, the UK, there's it seems like the technical capability for cyber historically has been in those either military or intelligence agencies. What is the impact? So, from your perspective, what is the impact of moving the cyber capability out of the military or out of the intelligence into another department? What does that actually mean when it comes to national security?
Yeah, so I mean, we mean different things in different kind of country contexts. So, I mean, interestingly, let's take a kind of slice of the UK context here. Our offensive cyber capability, which I think was announced I think it was 2020 or 2021, the National Cyber Force, is a joint enterprise. So we've tried to do something a bit different from many other countries, including China and the US, who do it kind of differently from each other as well. We have tried to to fuse the intelligence world with the military, uh, led by a partnership between GCHQ and the Ministry of Defence. So it's a genuine kind of fusion of all of that expertise, personnel, resources, to try and kind of bind all of that together. And there's a reason for that, because if you have an entirely kind of military entity, what you get is an entity that focuses on military requirements more than any other, naturally. You get a particular kind of culture, which impacts how you do business, potentially your creativity. And I think there's a lot to be said from having kind of diverse, as we would say in GCHQ, a mix of minds on a problem. And also in a UK context, we didn't just want to use the National Cyber Force for military issues. We wanted to use it to combat child sexual exploitation online or organised criminality. So all of these things we wanted to put into the same capability rather than trying to replicate them across government. So for us, it made sense to do it in that kind of fused way. For China, I mean, I think that there was a need to kind of scale up what they were doing, and also, taking it out of that kind of command and control structure gives you a higher degree of flexibility, deniability, creativity that you get in an intelligence sphere, much more so than in a military sphere. Just a more kind of freedom to scale and play around. I mean, for example, with things like kind of proxy actors. So yeah, lots of different approaches to cyber, kind of defensively and offensively, internationally. And maybe there isn't a kind of perfect way of doing it. It just depends on what your objectives are.
So thinking about it from a threat adversary perspective, if the impact of elevating the cyber capability to be not simply restricted to military targets, it seems like then as countries that might be targeted by those capabilities, it seems like the problem set is much larger. Meaning, if rather than simply going from one military to another, if you have an intelligence agency, perhaps they could go after commercial targets. Perhaps they could support other forms of warfare. So if we kind of flip from that to the defensive set, I'd love to get your thoughts around the idea of resiliency at a societal level, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about government resiliency, we're talking about resiliency of government institutions, of agencies, et cetera. But the reality is, in most Western nations, the critical infrastructure is privately owned, and so it becomes problematic then for government forces or for government capability to really have the authority to conduct defensive cyber operations or really to assist. So maybe just to start, I'd be very curious, what is your view on cyber resiliency? And perhaps how has that evolved, over the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I mean, cyber resilience is one component of a whole set of types of resilience that we are going to need to pursue as democracies and free world democracies. And I'm actually working on a project, which, thank you, Ian, you're going to provide a little bit of input to as well, with the Atlantic Council, that is looking to surface what the US and allies need to focus on in terms of resilience, kind of broadly, and certainly cyber is one component. So when I talk about resilience, I talk about it in the context of needing to manage the whole cycle of risk as it happens. So yes, you have kind of crises you need to manage, but then you need to sort of take a step back from that and think, okay, do we as a nation or as a company or as an individual, do we really understand the kind of risks that we are facing? Do we have the right set of information and inputs to be able to do that? And if we're confident we can understand it to the best of our ability, are we taking kind of sensible decisions about what to prioritize in terms of reducing our risk. Where are the kind of really big kind of areas of added value? Is that in focusing on CNI, for example, or is it making sure you've got your basic patches in your system? Like what are the kind of priority activities you can do to reduce the risk of actually ending up in some form of crisis? But I think resilience as a concept really just recognizes that crisis is often unavoidable. Like, you can maybe reduce the potential impact of it, but you are going to get moments where people, in context of a kind of cyber risk, where you will face some form of threat, right? So you might be able to reduce the risk of that, but you might also need to take action if you are attacked and if you are compromised. So it's then about how you manage that crisis, that sort of manifestation of risk in the moment when it happens, and then critically as well, how you adapt, how you recover, how quickly can you recover from these kind of shocks and disruptions to whether it's a nation or an enterprise, whatever it might be. Do you have the wherewithal to be getting back on your feet and running things as normally as possible? And I think that works up and down from like an international level right down to a kind of individual level as well. Yeah, so resilience is about being able to understand, respond, adapt, and recover. I mean, the other thing about resilience is that we think of lots of national areas of national security as being the preserve of government. And that is right, and proper when it comes down to really high-end capabilities, or military versus military, as you mentioned. But the problem is the risk landscape is now so much more diverse and complex, and our adversaries rightly see in open and free democracies that there are significant vulnerabilities at societal level that support the undermining of these elements of our society, can support their national security goals, either now or in the future, if you get into a situation where you might need to pull some levers to create influence or disruption. So most of that doesn't sit within government. Most of that sits outside of government and requires a completely cross-societal response to resilience. Government plays an important role because it regulates and it convenes and it engages and communicates and inspires and drives change. But the actual sort of commercial decisions that organisations take, it's the sort of aggregation of that decides how resilient a nation is in terms of its kind of cybersecurity and all other areas as well. So yeah, it's a really complex societal challenge, but I think we all have a duty to be thinking about what our contribution is to that overall kind of national resilience in the current risk climate, where it could be a water plant that's compromised, or look at Salt Typhoon, the compromise of large numbers of kind of telecoms companies that affects all of us. I mean, yes, we see the kind of high profile stories of tapping into phone calls between Trump and Vance, but that isn't that is only one element of something that should concern every citizen. It's a huge issue, and it's quite hard to get your head around this stuff as well, I think. So the scale of some of this is a little bit mind blowing, I think, for the average person.
Well, I think it's hard to sometimes see what's happening beneath the surface. One theme that I'd like to double click on is just around this idea of collaboration, both public and private sector, as well as between nations. So recent reports have indicated an increase in cyber collaboration between certain nations, such as Russia and China. But I think it's also worth calling out and maybe just exploring a little bit around the history of the Western Intelligence Alliance, which is the Five Eyes, made up between Canada, the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand. I believe you played a bit of a coordinating role within the Five Eyes Alliance. Is that correct?
Yes. So, I mean, in both of those senior roles I described, I've worked incredibly closely with my opposite numbers in all of the Five Eyes countries. You're right, we do collaborate extremely closely. I mean, I personally think that our Five Eyes alliance is, the most powerful aspect of our national security. Our ability to work as closely as we do is just an enormous strength. And although I like you pick up on these stories of Russia and China and others sort of working together in terms of capabilities or practical stuff. I I genuinely think that the level of trust that we have across the Five Eyes community is something completely different from that. There may be sort of examples of kind of tactical collaboration, but the kind of strategic level, all-in approach that we have across the Five Eyes gives us an operational edge that I don't think Russia and China will be able to replicate in any kind of hurry. I think the other thing that marks us apart as a kind of collaborating group is the respect for international laws and norms and rules, and the respect for the respect for the capabilities that are developed at a national international level. These are really powerful tools, and we are, as a Five Eyes community, a responsible group of cyber powers. We do not want to be behaving in ways that have indirect consequences, ways that carry too much risk, and we don't see the same from Russia and China. You just need to look at some of the attacks over the last kind of 5-10 years. SolarWinds is a really good example, like very indiscriminate, very kind of thoughtless about the kind of broader indirect consequences of some of these things versus the benefit that an adversary gets out of that operation. So there are some very kind of distinct, I mean, that gives them potentially a bit more operational freedom, but there is a big downside to that as well. So yeah, I think collaboration is extremely important, and I think we're very lucky as a set of nations to have each other's backs in the way that we do.
Can you share any insights or lessons learned trying to navigate some of those complexities? I mean, it feels to me like trying to get five nations to agree to something is a non-trivial task.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say is you can look at this from a kind of strategic level. Um, and we all agree we need to work together on particular issues. We burden share, so we split things off and concentrate on particular areas, and sort of trust a partner to kind of deal with that. But most of the power really here is in the joint working at team level. So mission teams that are tasked with particular objectives or jobs. That's where the real kind of power of this is. So I think if you go too kind of big in the conversation, you can find lots of disagreement. But actually, at a kind of tactical level, it's it's easy to work together. There are legislative, kind of operational, kind of technical complexities, but we're used to navigating all of that stuff. I would say, yeah, I mean, it can be complicated, but the sort of tax of working through that is nothing compared to the gain you get from the outcomes at the end of it.
So, staying on the topic of collaboration, could you maybe compare and contrast the use of proxies between what the Five Eyes does or does not do? You were talking about following international norms and laws versus what we see from other threat actors like Russia and China, where perhaps the line between what is a state actor versus what is a criminal enterprise might change depending on the time of day. And given certain types of attacks and where they're coming from, sometimes making it tricky to attribute to one or another. Is there anything you could comment in that regard?
Mm. Well, it won't surprise you to hear that I won't talk very much about what Five Eyes do in that sense, but certainly, yeah, you're right. I mean, the sort of the enabling of proxy actors, or the outsourcing of activities to proxy actors, is been a sort of increasing trend over the last 10 years. And I mean, I think, again, that sort of license that it gives non sort of elements that are not bound by the rules of government is the really dangerous element of this, because they are not sort of subject in many cases to the types of risk consideration that even an adversary might run through. They are kind of playing at things, and they are experimenting in ways that for a government would be kind of much harder. And there are potentially kind of operational upsides, but there are huge operational risks there that China and Russia are prepared to tolerate. And they're also prepared to, I mean, Russia particularly, ransomware criminals, you look at something like Colonial Pipeline, they're prepared to tolerate a high degree of geopolitical and relationship risk and tension there, in order to allow these groups to operate, which I think is also interesting. But yeah, I mean, it is one of the kind of key vectors of threat at the moment, isn't it? So yeah, we're all trying to get our systems around it, because it's different taking on actors like that to, as you would say, kind of direct state to state or military to military or whatever it might be.
So shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to get your thoughts on technology and specifically emerging technology. In the headlines just this last week were some announcements around quantum, and this idea that perhaps quantum computing is closer than it was last week. The other announcement was, I think it was the Australia Signals Directorate, ASD, just recently came out and said that most forms of encryption they're no longer going to support past 2030. I'm not going to ask you to comment specifically on what crypto to use moving forward, but I am curious about your thoughts around some of the emerging technologies, be it quantum, be it Gen AI. Are there specific areas that are that maybe have captivated your interest more than others, as we kind of look ahead into the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm no kind of quantum expert. I sort of saw that news report as well. I mean, I would defer to you, Ian. I'm sure you know a lot more. I felt unable to judge whether I thought we were closer to breakthrough there, but I would be interested in your take on it. But yeah, I mean, it's going to come, isn't it? At some point, it's going to come, and we are already preparing for that in many different ways, in government and commercially. Many big companies are also in that space. That post-quantum environment is going to be something very different. But yeah, the advances are not kind of linear, are they? And we've seen with something like ChatGPT, the sudden kind of leaps forward, and how it doesn't feel like a smooth ride. It's going to be, it's going to be the same with any kind of big quantum breakthrough. It's going to feel like there are sort of major accelerations at points. But I mean, I think the other thing I would say about all of this is that we do tend to talk quite negatively about these developments. Of course, there's huge amounts of risk to kind of navigate there, but there is also, for countries and companies that are technologically capable and savvy, the opportunity space is huge, not just for national security, but for the whole of society. So, yeah, you've got to manage the risk, but I sometimes worry that we're not optimistic enough about some of the things we can achieve with these advances as well.
So what you're saying is cybersecurity is not going to go away anytime soon? Is that the takeaway?
I think you're not going to go out of business, Ian, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Um, what keeps you up at night?
Oh gosh. Well, lots of things actually. But I worry that we don't acknowledge the potential for some of these really high impact but low likelihood events to happen. Okay, so COVID is a good example of that, right? We knew we could have a pandemic, but we hadn't really sort of imagined ourselves into that space. Um, the potential for something somewhere in the world, a nuclear incident of some kind, worries me, um, and our kind of preparedness to deal with a situation like that. Um, I worry about increasing sort of tension between the US and China if we did get into that sort of much discussed scenario around Taiwan. Um, I think probably the US domestically, its citizens, and same in the UK and probably Canada, haven't really understood what that will mean domestically. So all of these reports of the compromises of CNI, they're not just about what China can gain now, they're also about what they will gain in a moment of conflict or tension. And that has the potential to be extremely disruptive and undermining civil society. So I do worry about that as well. Um, yeah, that's probably enough to worry about, I think, maybe for now. But yeah, there is it's a dangerous. It feels like one of the most dangerous moments in time, and it's been good to not worry as much as we have done in the past about areas like counterterrorism. But you only need to look at what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Syria at the moment to see that it doesn't take very much for that environment to change and for us to start kind of facing similar types of threats that we saw emerging in the early 2000s as well. So yeah, there's a lot to watch out for. But I think there's a lot of positivity as well that is coming through technological advances. So it's a balance between concern and optimism, I think.
Uh, I've super appreciated this conversation. Beth, if you had one message perhaps for policymakers and business leaders about the future of cyber and national security, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, I think probably think about that concept of resilience. Think about, what it means for you to understand the risks that you face, to prepare for events happening, and to build, the ability to respond and the ability to recover quickly. So think about that concept and make it into kind of practical plans and draw in help where you need it, because really, I think most people dealing with these issues need to bring in help. Government does, as an individual. I don't. I look to the advice from the NCSC to see what to do with my passwords and all the rest of it. So we can't ever just do these things ourselves. So collaborate, learn, and bring in help.
Beth, thank you so much.
No problem.